Michael, I hope you'll refer to the state party reports. You can do a lot in the interim.
You bet. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael.
I was kind of in the queue, and I was hoping I would get to respond to Michael a little bit more than that quick comment that I made, Brett, but I'll say it for the benefit of everyone else here. We're not, and I know I've mentioned this in spaces before, we're not alone in this. There are best practices that are being used in other countries, and when they are state parties to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, they provide state party reports to the United Nations. That means their best practices. There's a best practices report from the UN. There's a best practices report from the European Union. Australia has submitted their best practices, their state party report of how they are dealing with these issues. So we can do this. And last year, it was tabled at the United Nations. I'm just going to find the right wording for it. It was under it was under Employment, Social Affairs, and Inclusion. The United Nations Convention tabled a report about interim universal basic income measures and implementation strategies. And they had the best practices in those recommendations from countries that shared their information. And that's what the advantage is of being part of the United Nations in various different conventions. You share your experiences, you share the problems that you're having, you share your solutions, you share your strengths and your weaknesses and your next best steps, so that everybody else that's building on these has this kind of resource too. So I would like everybody to know that when you're talking to people like Michael, who are sitting at a table and are able to give direction in terms of how we're developing legislation, you don't have to cite all of these, like every fact. All you have to do is just cite that there are best practice reports. There are state party reports to the United Nations that are shared. Every country has access to them, and they can see ways that issues are rolled out and how they've taken things that they were at a stalemate about the definition of disability in Australia, and they talked about how they overcame that to create their universal basic income. They talked about how how federal payments are stacked, it's called. They don't affect provincial payments. And then the other thing I'd say about provincial, that's something that we should all be talking about in the provinces that have elections this year. That's an election issue. When somebody knocks on your door that's a candidate, even if they don't have an answer for you, you have a question for them of, are you going to make sure that the provincial disability payouts are not affected by any federal subsidy that comes? You know, it can be as simple as that. So that's really what I wanted to say. There are so many reports. Australia is one of the first countries that was a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So they have the most state party reports that are sent and that are accessible online at the United Nations website too. But they're all there, and any country with a ministry for people living with disabilities that is exploring new legislation, they have these resources that they can use. So an interim payout is very doable in the very short term. We're not going into this blind. I will say that again. There are so many reports that show best practices, and they're shared in a responsible way through the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Those state parties share those reports, and we can be leveraging that information to work more quickly. As long as when we have the opportunity to, as long as we're pressing and making sure that these people are aware that there are case studies, there are best practices that are there for their very valuable resource to be able to do something in the short term. Yeah, the UN report was in July of 2020, and it's how to give temporary basic income to vulnerable populations in different segments, and it's all laid out